Welcome back to Triumph Talks. We are talking again with John Peace about his book, A Boy from Cracker's Neck, featuring the stories told to him by his Papaw, Captain Jimmie Galloway, who flew a B-17 bomber in World War II. The focus of our conversation today is a chapter in the book titled Drafting the Crew. So, John, thank you for coming back and continuing to enlighten us on these.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, these are some exciting and interesting, historically important, and very often funny stories. I will point that out. But for this chapter, it begins by highlighting just how much your Papaw, Jimmie Galloway, enjoyed being in the military. And why did he love signing up with this great adventure that it was, I guess, at first?
Well, and to put his story in context was, growing up, and this could be rural America, it could even be urban America. Just if you grow up in an area that has a lot of poverty, and like I say, I keep telling now, he did not grow up hungry. They grew up on a little farm and they had everything they needed, but they did not have money. Cash money was a very scarce commodity. In fact, they kind of grew up in kind of a barter system where his mom would trade eggs and trade dressed geese and dressed chickens for store-bought commodities, and that was the barter system. Mm-hmm. So you grow up in that area where, let me tell you, where you had one pair of shoes if you're lucky, and you went barefoot the rest of the time, and it wasn't out of being convenient or that's what you did. You didn't want to wear out that one pair of shoes you had.
That's why they went barefoot.
Yes.
Wow.
Granddad said, "Oh, everybody thinks that's fun and dandy," but he said, "No, you didn't." And you put your clothes up because you had one good pair you wore to church. And then if you're lucky, and he was very lucky, him and his siblings were lucky that they did have school clothes and stuff. But so many people, and there's one little story about one of his buddies walking into school with only one shoe on, and the principal asked him, "Woodrow, did you lose a shoe?" And he said, "No, sir, I found one." And to think about being so poor and so hungry that you find one shoe and you put it on and you wear it.
You'd walk around one shoe on, one shoe off, just because you had a shoe.
Yeah. Yes.
That
and
really.
So go back to that time. You enlist. You went from most of these men grew up in poverty, so you and hunger, and you enlist, and all of a sudden there's 3 meals a day, and there's food everywhere. They're handing you brand new clothes. And most important, now this was one common theme with every character in this book: the boots, the shoes. They would talk about having new shoes and new boots on.
Yeah. And something to eat. I'd like to read from your book if I could, just a little bit.
Yes.
I think this is so interesting. Jimmie had never gone to bed with an empty stomach, nor had his siblings, but he knew he was surrounded by hunger during the Great Depression. Friends, family, neighbors, nearly everyone he met had experienced some level of hunger. It says, in the military, however, everyone had plenty of food. The mess hall was a sight to behold for Jimmie and every other new recruit. The quality of the food may not have been as good as Ma's cooking, but there was one thing all military mess halls had that she didn't: quantity. I love that. And it talks about how the men who grew up hungry would actually fill their trays and eat every bite and stuff their pockets and take it back with them to the barracks, because they weren't used to, they were still living with that sense of it might not be there tomorrow, even though it was there every single day. They never quite got over that fear of being without.
Yeah. And you'll meet people even in today's times. If they grew up hungry, that fear never ever leaves them. It's always in the back of their mind. In fact, I was just speaking to somebody just a week ago, and they'd had a real bad childhood, and hunger was a part of their childhood, unfortunately. And he said, I don't think that won't be part of my planning for my futures. I always make sure I have enough resources to eat.
How many of us think about retirement like, Yeah, I just need to be able to eat. It's
Oh yeah, I mean
that kind
today
of
we're
poverty
worried
isn't.
about buying cars or buying
Yeah,
houses or
having a
maintaining
cell
my
phone.
lifestyle,
Yeah,
and those people just were waking up worrying about where am I going to find some food to eat.
yeah.
And another thing you brought up is talking about the military pay. Um,
Hmm.
you know, my granddad grew up in a community. It was surrounded by coal mining industry and stuff. You don't realize cash paying jobs were so scarce. They always wanted to pay you. One of the things we talked a little bit about is script money.
Yes, in
And
the
that's a
coal
whole nother
towns.
area. And then
Yeah.
also stock options. If the company couldn't afford to pay people, they just issue some stock to them and say, well, we'll pay you when we can. So, having a cash paying job was a very rare thing. And
And
a lot of
and
times,
Jimmy
even,
was getting paid, according to your book. It said that
yeah,
at $161 per month, Jimmy was making more money than he had ever made in his life. Not
yes.
to mention the additional $20 per month for hazard bomber crew pay.
I forgot to kind of put in the book. He would joke about the extra $20 was because of the hazard pay,
Yeah,
and he said, "Son, I really should have probably thought about that a little bit more." Once he got into the war, that why are they paying a little extra for if you'll agree to be a bomber pilot? And of course, his brother was a P-51 fighter pilot. Of course, he did a dangerous job also, but
yeah.
the hazard pay, and also he talked about. The bomber pay, they had a little bit bigger life insurance policy. And one thing he said, well, I'm probably not going to live through this, but at least my wife and my daughter should have enough money to have a better life.
And in the
Now
first part
that's
of the
hard to,
war, in the first
yeah,
part of the war,
yeah,
I think it was true that you probably know. I don't have it in my head right now, but they got shot down pretty regularly. It got better towards the end, but at the beginning of
yes.
the war, the the life expectancy of a bomber crew member was not very good. Do you
Oh,
remember?
5 to 6 missions, five to
Okay,
six.
five to
Yeah,
six missions.
yeah,
That says a lot. So for him to
yeah,
make it to, and we'll talk about this in another
yeah,
video, but to make it to the Lucky Bastard Club of 30 missions,
yes,
that was a big deal. So it really does show the
yeah,
danger. So it says in here that Jimmy decided to keep the $20 hazard bomber crew pay for himself as a little extra spending cash, but the rest of his earnings were headed straight back to his wife. And then in the book, it talks about how she got to go and open, probably for the first time, a bank account at the Big
yes,
Stone Gap Bank and Trust right there in Appalachia. And it was a proud moment for her. And when the bank manager saw how much money she was putting into the account, he joked, "Who did Jimmy kill to get so much money?"
yes,
And Jane knew the answer. Her husband was putting his life on the line every day, and he was earning every penny. I love
yeah.
that. I love how you included both the just the amazement of being able to open an account, to just show where they were coming from and have so much money, but yet what he was really doing to be able to earn.
Yeah, kind of remind all these men. What's it from literature? The best of times, the worst of times, and they were actually experiencing that.
Yeah.
Yes, it was the worst of times as far as the danger and all that, but the amount of pride he was talking about those uniforms
Mhm.
and the pride of having money for the first time in his life. And he talked about for the first, and this was in flight school. He said, "So that was the first time I could remember having a little bit of money to go. What do I want to do with? Actually, have choices." Used to if they grew up so poor, they had any money, you knew what you were going to spend on food or necessities. But to have spending money,
Yeah.
ah, you know, that
Yeah.
it's hard for us to imagine, but that was such a treat for them.
That's what I love about your book is that there's so much of appreciation for how far we
Yeah.
have come, and
Yes.
what they lived through in the war, but even just preceding it. So let's get to the
Hmm.
topic of the chapter. The title of the chapter is "Drafting the Crew," and I just think this is such a fascinating um, event that happened in Captain Jimmie Galloway's life as he arrived at MacDill Field in Tampa, Florida.
Hmm.
It was like the very next day after he arrived. He had just finished his training on the Flying Fortress, and it was time to pick his crew. and he was
Yes.
supposed to go first thing in the morning. And you write that picking the crew is much like draft day of a sports franchise,
It
where they
was
would.
that
Mhm.
particular time and period. I'm not sure if that was common at all the bases. That was just what was told, that
That's what
particular
he
time.
experienced. And
Yeah.
you said that
Hmm.
they actually they did a lot of preparation. They'd go into it and know the personal records of the gunners and the navigators and the bombardiers and the radio operators and all the people they were going to choose from. But he had just arrived, and I don't know if why he didn't have a lot of time to prepare. And then that
Now,
morning he got summoned to go back to medical because there was some they had just lost his TB screening. It wasn't a problem with
yeah.
the actual TB test. It was lost, which made him run late. And if you would, I'd love you to read what happened to Captain Jimmie Galloway when he arrived late to the bomber crew draft.
Yes. Major Graham barked, "Damn doctors, they should have let you come pick your crew first and then they're done their freaking test. Anyway, you're here now, but I don't recommend what crew officers we have left. All the other pilots have picked their crews." Jimmie replied, "Sir, why do you say that? What's wrong with them?" Major Graham handed Jimmie their personnel files, and Jimmie started to scan through them. "Sir, hell, all but two of these men are college graduates from top notch colleges that I even recognize. Why didn't other pilots want them as their crew?" Major Graham, looking at Jimmie, "Damn, son, where are you from, stupid hillbilly? You don't recognize the names or see their religious affiliation? The, the college boys are goddamn Jews, and that one there named Smitty's almost a midget in size, and that tall one has no schooling over there, and he's a troublemaker from Texas, I can tell. You don't want this crew, son. I'll have a new batch of crews to pick from coming in next week. You can wait till then." Jimmie was still scanning over the personnel files. The co-pilot listed was Bob Birkenfield, was even the quarterback of Boston University football team. And as in the book, my Papaw was a football player in high school, so
Mhm.
that was a common thing. As he was thinking to himself how the only two Jews that he ever met back home in Cracker's Neck were Attorney Gladstone and Old Man Coins, who owned a department store in Norton. They sure did seem like fine fellas to him. Paul had always told him that if you ever get a choice of who you work with, choose fellow workers who were smart. Dumbasses and fools will get you killed in the mines quicker than anything. Jimmie asked the major if he could have a few minutes to talk to some of the men before he made this decision. Major replied, "Take a few minutes and let me know. I'll be over at my office." Jimmie was going to bite the bullet and wanted to find out how the two non-Jewish airmen felt about working with the other Jews. Jimmie motioned for Tex and Smitty to come out while the other airmen stayed in the meeting room. Jimmie said, "Tex Smith from Texarkana, Texas. Is that your real name?" Tex replied, "Yes, sir. Believe it or not, Tex Smith is my official name. Is it my God given name? I have no idea. I was an orphan from birth, sir." Jimmie straightened his back and got one simple question for both of you. The rest of the crew in there are Jewish. Do either one of you have a problem flying with them and living with them? Tex grinned from ear to ear. "Sir, I don't have any damn religion. And from what I'm hearing about the war and the slaughterhouse meat grinder we're heading into, we better partner up with some buddies that have some damn religion. I hear that Jews have all kinds of religion, and maybe some will rub off on us." Little Smitty responded, "I agree with Tex. I hear the chances of us living through our tour are pretty damn thin. Sir, some religion sounds okay with me." So the crew of Little Helen was born.
That's I think that's so significant to show the some of the prejudice that existed even as we were going into this war to the very people that I guess we didn't really know what was going on at the time with the Holocaust. But
Yes.
there was a
No,
lot of
well, no.
anti-Semitism on this side of the war, and to the
Yes.
point that such amazing people were considered less desirable in the bomber
Yes.
crew. Yeah.
One thing my papa always talked about was he said, modern history books, if they're just given kind of a broad strokes of history, they kind of gloss over the anti-Semitism back during the early 1900s. You still had a lot of people that blamed the Jews for World War I. And in case that major was the same way, he was probably a major during World War One. So you had a
Interesting.
lot of, yeah. So he was a
Interesting.
major, so he would have been in the war before World War II started out. So you had a lot of the career military people that didn't want Jews in the military,
Hmm.
and they blamed them for World War One. And then, of course, at the start of World War II, they were blaming the Jews for World War II. So, but like my papa talked about, he said, "Son, I didn't know any Jews," and he said, "Nobody told me we were supposed to hate them." And but also he told me, he said, I didn't pick them out being a just or moral person or even a good Christian. He said, I just didn't know any better.
Yeah.
He said, I grew up in a little community, and you go back to a time where he grew up in the 20s and 30s. No TV, no radio, access to even books was very limited. And if there's no Jews in your community, you don't even think about them.
Yeah.
They're
And
not part of your world.
yeah. Or
So,
just
they seem like fine guys to him.
and they
Yeah.
were, right? I mean, they ended up
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
a very strong crew. And the point, I think the point is that we have these propaganda messages that come about, we're separated by all kinds of things. Are you
Yeah.
politically too different from me, or religiously too different from me? And we see this right now in our world. And I think we're all concerned about it.
Yeah.
And this, I love this experience that's in your book, because it just shows how petty and
Mhm.
inconsequential it is. Because
Yes.
ultimately, what matters is getting to know each other. And I think even, or you were saying as we were talking, when you get to know somebody and you connect with them, then all of these different walls that have been put up by society, or that we're told that we should be
Mhm.
put up, they just come down, and they're just a person to you, and they're not a
Mhm.
Jew or a this or a that. And gosh, I think that if there's any way we could get just even that episode of your grandfather's experience to be shared with the world in this book,
Yes.
and to just show how much we can come together. And they were just a powerful crew. And as we'll bring up in some future episodes, as we talk through some of your chapters, they went through some pretty harrowing experiences, and were part of some very significant historical missions, and
Mhm.
almost didn't make it a few times.
Yes.
But what a great group, and I'm sure they just were so tight during that time. And so I just think it's so interesting that the way that crews were drafted, and how he ended up at the last minute with what might have actually been, for all we know, it'd be interesting to go back and do the research. It might have been the very best crew to come out of that particular group to go over to the war. How many? I would be interesting to see how many came out of his. I'm not sure what to call it, the class that he was in. How many of them made it to the Lucky Bastard Club? I mean, how many of them lived? And
I tried researching
did
that.
you?
I really did.
Yeah.
But a lot of the World War II record book or records got burned up in some fire outside of DC.
Oh,
So a lot of, see, I wanted to pull individual like record missions and stuff like that. So a lot of that stuff got lost to history
yeah.
because of a fire.
Well, but
And
thankfully to you and your
mhm,
storytelling and your grandpa's storytelling. Sorry, I'm going to call him
yes,
grandpa, because I'm going to say Papaw or Papa wrong. Your
Papaw,
Papa's storytelling,
Papaw,
Papaw Galloway's storytelling,
yeah,
some very important experiences, things I'd never even heard of. Now, I'm going to tell you, I am a huge war history fan. I just
hmm
am. I got started. I have a book called the Triumph Book, Heroes Edition, stories of veterans from World War II up through our recent conflicts. I've
hmm
interviewed them in person. I love war movies. I just think it's um, the most interesting stories in the world come from that time. And so I consider myself relatively well read, and you told stories and experiences I had no idea had happened. And I just
well,
think
thank you.
it's just so great. I love your book.
Well, and that goes back to our earlier conversations. We've had some of these wonderful books and some wonderful documentaries and miniseries, but they always started kind of at the wartime.
Hmm.
Band of Brothers right
Hmm.
at boot camp, but they didn't give it kind of the context of what they grew up in that made them
Yeah.
believe and made them tough, made them who they were. You
Yeah.
got to take fact. See, we're looking back on World War II in the history, and there's no question on which was the good side, because
Yeah.
we, like you said, we know about the Holocaust now.
Yeah.
But at that time, before, when the war was just starting, there was still debate on which side we should be on.
Isn't that amazing? Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
and you had people and then you had a big chunk of people that didn't want no part of it after World War I. The
Hmm.
Great War, and then you had some that did not think we were on the right side either. So and then you look in history books, you see that there was an American Nazi Party
Yeah.
in America,
Yeah.
and that's hard to believe that there was an active party. It
Yeah.
kind of gets brushed over and stuff, and you had people, and you had some very important people that, and the reason why I put that in there, it all goes back to eugenics, and that all in the early 1900s through 1920s, you had some famous and you had some American leaders that believed in eugenics. I won't
Yeah.
go in details what all that is,
Some
but
very high
if you're
profile
listening to
ones.
this,
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah. It's
and
hard to believe now, but yet, I don't
yeah,
know. It seems like we always find some way of packaging somebody's beliefs or, into becoming,
hmm
that's on the other side of right. And it,
yeah,
it shifts over time. And that really does, I think it just comes down to why it's so important that history be written, and not just by, say, well, history is written by the victors, right? Well,
yes,
yes, but it's important to be written by us, by you, by me, by the people watching this. Everyone has something
hmm
to contribute to history.
yes,
And it's really important. And we don't get to pick and choose how history happened either. So it does mean
hmm
we may have to talk about things like this experience where the Jews that were up for becoming part of a bomber crew were all left, sort of the runts of the litter that nobody
hmm
wanted. It's I hope that wouldn't offend anybody to hear about that, because it's just what happened. And
that
what do
now
we
that
learn
happened.
from that?
hmm
That's why history needs to be recorded accurately and not covered, and not hidden. And we can't call history offensive because it already happened. It just is
Yeah.
what it is. And what's important is, what did we learn from it, and how do we move forward and get better? And I think that when we don't preserve our history properly and keep the full history, we can,
Mhm.
and this is so cliche, but it's true, is we can end up making the same mistakes because we didn't learn from it. So it has to be there for us to learn from. And there's just so many
Mhm.
great lessons in your book, and they're very inspiring lessons and encouraging. I think that, again, I love stories from war because they're real heroes. These are good fighting bad, and and there's sometimes there's bad in the good. It's just
Yeah.
it's what make life so interesting, and being a human being so interesting. Yeah. So, John, I look forward to our next show, which we'll be
Okay. Well,
recording
thank you.
shortly. I am sure it will be available in this space, or you can click on to watch the next. We will love it if you binge watch us, as they say. We're going to make a lot of shows for you to binge watch. And very soon, there will also be a channel. Well, actually, I say very soon, that kind of dates this show. But as of right now, when you watch it, I'm sure there's a channel called Back Porch Tales, which is actually a new YouTube channel that John and I are starting, where he can tell more of these amazing stories that come from our history, from rural America. And so be watching for that. And as soon as I can, I'll put maybe the link to it up there, or in future shows. So be sure to like this if you enjoyed it. Subscribe to Triumph Talks. You can catch more of these shows when they are made live. And keep following.